Pakistan has agreed to includes tax increases, increases in transfer payments under the BISP. And it seems to me that this can be self-defeating. One of the issues that I have with a lot of the IMF lending programs is that they come with strings attached that make it very difficult to achieve the economic growth and dynamism that's required for an economy to become self-sustaining and wean itself from the need for these programs. The country's debt issue, which ultimately needs to be addressed through economic growth and prosperity, doesn't seem to be the right roadmap to me. Tax increases don't seem to be the right roadmap.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Liberty Talk. I have with me a very special guest. I have Peter Goettler with me, who's the president and CEO of the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is maybe one of the most well-known libertarian think tanks working in the United States. Prime Institute is greatly inspired by many of the works. We share several shared values, including our appreciation for liberty, life, and property. And pleasure to have you, Peter, on the podcast.
Great to be here.
So, Peter, tell us a little bit about libertarianism. I often struggle to explain to my contemporaries what it is that we're all about.
Well, I had a great teacher, David Bowes, who was the executive vice president of Cato for 40 years. I got to listen to how David explained libertarianism. And the best way he ever did was just to say we believe in a high degree of freedom, both in our personal lives, our dealings with other individuals, our family, our friends, and a high degree of liberty and freedom in our economic lives as well. So when we're dealing commercially with others or in commerce or business. And in the United States, you may know we have a two-party system.
That's correct.
And people on the right, the conservatives, generally, at least rhetorically, espouse economic freedom.
Right.
And on the left, progressives tend to espouse, individual freedom. And, we basically take both of those elements, personal freedom and economic freedom. The way I really think about it is libertarianism is the philosophy. It's a moral philosophy that we each own our own lives, and we shouldn't be coerced to do things that we don't want to do as long as we're not interfering with the freedom and rights of others to do the same.
All right. So just to tell me about the work of the Cato Institute. Now you have about 45 odd years under your belt. And what is it? What are the different areas of interest that the Cato Institute is working on?
Well, it was a nice compliment for you to say that Cato is one of the most important libertarian think tanks. In the United States, we believe that Cato is one of the primary libertarian voices. So we really feel we have a responsibility to be that libertarian voice across the full range of policy areas. So whether it's foreign policy, trade, other economics, the Constitution and the rule of law, civil liberties, these are all areas of importance for Cato. I recently redrafted our mission statement as part of the suggestion of one of our board of directors that we should draft a statement of principles to let the world know what Cato really stands for. And we did that. And as part of it, we changed our mission statement to really make it consist of two parts. One, we feel that we want to be the guardians of the ideas of liberty for future generations, to keep the ideas of freedom and liberty alive for those who come after us. And then second, we want to move policy to the extent that we can in a more liberty-friendly direction. Mm-hmm. So we tend to operate in the policy space through external engagement with policymakers in the legislative branch and the executive branch of government in the 50 states, at the state level government. We engage with academics, media, in order to get our points of view on policy out into the stream of ideas. But education is also an important part of what we do, and that relates to that element of the mission statement I said about keeping the flame and the ideas of liberty alive for future generations. So whether it's educating students, or we have a major program now that we've built over the last 5 years where we have a network of middle school and high school educators that we engage with ecumenically around the idea of civic culture and responsible disagreement and viewpoint diversity. But within that framework, libertarian points of view are represented. And that's one of the ways. And then we have a number of other student programs and just general, whether it's through technology, many forms of engaging content to try to promulgate, our point of view, our ideas, our policy prescriptions to a broader audience.
And you work only in the United States, that's correct?
Our focus is on the United States, but we do have a significant effort in what we call our Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity that is more international in scope. That's run by one of our vice presidents, Ian Vasquez. There's actually a flagship product that many people outside the United States might be familiar with. It's our Human Freedom Index. For many years, we've been the U.S. publisher and partner with the Fraser Institute on their Economic Freedom of the World Index. And when that work was first being developed, it was Milton Friedman who said, boy, wouldn't it be great? An economic freedom index is a great idea, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually develop a more holistic measure of freedom and measure freedom not just economically, getting back to your initial question about libertarianism. It's personal freedom, civil liberties, freedom in our personal lives, as well as economic freedom. And at the time he made that suggestion, there simply wasn't data available in order to try to measure around the world, freedom in any holistic sense. Mm-hmm. And about 8 or 9 years ago, we published for the first time the Human Freedom Index, because now there is data available where for not quite as many countries as we do the economic work for, but 165 countries, we have a very holistic view of freedom. We rank 165 countries on the overall degree of freedom and within them.
Right. So, I'd like to start talking about economic policy. I've come across a lot of literature coming out of the Cato Institute on economic policy, and a lot of your views, they might be very new to many of our audiences here because they're neither conservative and they're neither left-leaning, not towards the progressivist side. So tell me about what are Cato's general stances on what economic policy should be like and what should be the outcomes from it.
We believe in small government, less government intervention in the economy. Government spending, government intervention crowds out, private enterprise, private initiative. Government regulation, there has to be, one of the things I mentioned, our statement of principles. One of the things in there states that, the presumption should be to liberty, that people who would propose coercion or regulation, they should have the burden of proof should be on them as to why we need it. And we think there's generally too much regulation of the economy, too much intervention in the economy. There are certainly areas where there are cases of public goods or externalities where there may be a case for regulation, but the government just makes way too many rules, and it stifles economic growth, it stifles economic creativity, economic dynamism. So that's a prime size of government regulation are primary areas. Also, there's been a move in the United States, particularly on the part of conservatives, to begin restricting trade, to be more protectionist. We advocate quite strongly for open trade, free trade. Globalization has become a dirty word in some parts of the world. We embrace it unabashedly. We've been engaged over the last year and a half in a comprehensive project called Defending Globalization, making the case that globalization, that open trade, freer migration have been essential ingredients in the dramatic decline in extreme poverty that's taken place around the world in recent decades. So that's an important element. And as you're probably aware, the United States, we've got, the system of entitlement programs that are kind of on autopilot and growing significantly as really a couple of factors: increasing cost of medical care, but aging of the population. It's clear that they're not sustainable. So trying to make the case that we need reform of those entitlement programs and the engines of government spending to avert a fiscal crisis is an important element of our work as well.
I wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about. So you said that Cato stands for a lot of open trade and free markets and international trade. Now you have a new president coming in to office in January. Donald Trump will be coming in, and we've had some experience with him. He is not maybe the most pro-free trade guy. What is your opinion on the upcoming regime? Do you think it's going to be supportive of the things that Cato talks about, or do you think we're entering some period of crisis where we might see major restrictions on international trade?
The picture is potentially bleak in the trade arena, but we just talked about a whole range of economic areas of economic policy. And I think it's probably important to look at the bigger picture with respect to Trump. There's clearly been, he did have a generally good record on deregulation in his first term, maybe not quite as positive as many of his supporters would have us believe. But as we head into the second term, there seems to be a very strong focus on less economic regulation. Some of the appointments he's made, for example, Paul Atkins as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. You may have heard about the Department of Government Efficiency that Trump's created, that's being led jointly by Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk to bring. I mean, I think government efficiency, we interpret that as less regulation. So there's certainly some areas where there's optimism. There's also been a lot of hope that there will be progress on spending, and that the tax cuts that were implemented in Trump's first term that are set to expire next year in 2025 will be extended. I will say that I'm trying to be as hopeful and optimistic as possible. When you have players like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk in the frame, who are very driven, very focused on this stuff, certainly that changes the calculus, and there's hope that we'll see some progress in actually shrinking the size of government. But I will say one of the things that tempers my optimism a bit is to do anything meaningful and lasting in terms of really changing the size of government, and particularly the amount of money the government spends. You really do need action by Congress. And at least at this point, there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite in the Republican caucus, which will have a slim majority in both the House and the Senate, for spending cuts. My hope is that, that there's a dynamic here with some of the players involved in the focus on trying to shrink government, that could change. With respect to areas where we're much more wary of the incoming administration, very concerned, as you say, about what could happen on trade. I mean, Trump has talked about putting in very significant and broad-based tariffs, which would be, I think, potentially very damaging to the economy. Will create higher prices for consumers and create a lot of friction in international relations. It'll create all kinds of problems for manufacturers in the U.S. who import components and raw materials from overseas. It was interesting. One of the things that gets highlighted in the U.S. is there was a tweet that Trump once sent out about that trade wars are a really good thing and they're easy to win. And those two things are both very untrue. There's really no way to win a trade war.
Would you agree that there is a global movement towards nationalism, and we're seeing maybe a possible basis for reducing the level of globalization across the world? What is your reading on that?
Oh, that's definitely true. In the U.S., many of the traditional allies we've had arguing for more global openness, freer trade, have really shifted gears. And
so you're talking about Europe?
We tend to be much more of a lonelier voice in the U.S. making these arguments. But we do think that, as you suggest, the stakes are high. We've invested a lot, as I mentioned, in this project we've had over the last year and a half to defend globalization, to really make the case for not just freer trade, but more open migration as well, because as we discussed a moment ago, these have been important engines in increasing global prosperity, reducing global poverty, and it really is. It does show how we try to be strategic about how we deploy resources and staff and our work towards areas that are represent either significant opportunities in the policy world or potentially significant threats.
How much traction does the libertarian voices or the influential libertarian voices in the USA, how much traction do they have with government and policymakers and decision makers? Do you think it's a successful line of thought?
I think it is. People sometimes ask me, well, has there ever been a libertarian society? Well, I don't think there's ever been a society that lives up completely to the fully to the ideals of libertarianism. But, the founding of the United States was a really great libertarian moment. And as you and I were discussing earlier, if you read the United States Constitution, it's a libertarian document. And so I think that libertarian, even if they're not identified as libertarian, these values, these principles are fairly deeply rooted in the American DNA. And I think one of the things that, even though might not be identified as libertarian, a lot of people like to say that there are many people in the United States who are libertarian and don't realize it because they don't necessarily go by the label. And I think that there's an element of truth to that. The other thing that I think Cato's been responsible for is, mainstreaming the concept of libertarianism in the United States. Like maybe we've moved away from the idea of the United States being a libertarian country because we have these two political parties. And I always say the two-party system is kind of an artificial construct, and neither of these parties, as they've emerged, is libertarian. But I think there are a lot of Americans who are either, whether they're members of those parties or whether they're unaffiliated, as is suggested, or maybe more libertarian than they realize. Cato, I think, has been the MVP in the United States. I think you guys have that term, MVP, the most valuable player. I'm sure there are cricketers who get the MVP, right?
That's something. Yeah.
Of kind of mainstreaming libertarian thought and mainstreaming the brand of libertarianism as well.
How compatible is the Cato Institute's view of international relations of the United States with different countries with that of Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump has been described as an isolationist in the past, but at the same time, I read a lot of literature from Cato about open borders and, a visa-free regime for cross-border travel. How do you see that?
Well, I don't think you read a lot of information from Cato about open borders because we don't really subscribe to an open borders regime. We advocate for a much freer level of legal immigration.
Right.
One of the reasons that we have an issue with illegal migration into the United States is that the legal avenues for migration into the U.S. are pretty much closed. Right. And as long as our economy is demanding labor provided by immigrants, people are going to find a way in, and there's going to be demand for those people as well. So we advocate very strongly for opening the legal channels, and that's a way that would reduce the incentives for people to illegally migrate to the U.S. I always push back against the term isolationist because I think the United States, Cato has made the case for decades that the United States is should exercise more restraint in the potential exercise of military power. We advocate strongly for us not to seek to be the policeman, of the world. We think we've used the military too much. We think our government tends to, or those who run our government tend to sometimes exaggerate threats, overestimate the efficacy of armed intervention, and underestimate the unintended consequences of military intervention. So we advocate for more restraint in foreign policy. That often gets us caricatured as isolationists. And, we don't think that that's necessarily a fair characterization. we advocate, unlike Donald Trump, we do line up at least with Donald Trump's instincts in foreign policy towards less military intervention. We do worry about Trump a bit because he's a pretty impulsive guy. So we worry about, okay, if his instincts might be right in foreign policy, leaning towards more restraint in military intervention, could his impulsiveness, compromise those instincts? But also, he doesn't advocate for more openness in the world. We reject the idea that we're isolationists. We advocate for, I don't think anyone advocates for more engagement with the broader world than American libertarians do through open trade, through freer migration, et cetera. So we believe in engagement. We believe in diplomatic engagement. We even believe that there are circumstances under which, military intervention, can be necessary. But we think that our government tends to reach for the military option, much too quickly.
One of the aspects of this is the military intervention that the USA engages in. But then there is the other aspect where, for a country like Pakistan, we've been engaging with the United States through different multilateral agencies. We are a non-NATO ally. We have been in an IMF program for the longest time. And while this is a multilateral institution, it is majorly backed by the United States of America. So how do you see the role of these multilateral agencies for countries like Pakistan that are kind of finding their way in their development, economic development, as well as their liberalization of social values and culture?
One of the issues that I have with a lot of the IMF lending programs is that they come with strings attached. So you have a country like Pakistan who recently agreed to, I think, a $7 billion program with the IMF in September. And that is necessary in order to address the country's debt issue, which ultimately needs to be addressed through economic growth and prosperity. And the challenge that I see with these IMF programs, even though I'm not an expert in this area, is that they often come with strings attached that make it very difficult to achieve the economic growth and dynamism that's required for an economy to become self-sustaining and wean itself from the need for these programs. So, for example, I understand that some of the conditions to the recent IMF program that Pakistan has agreed to includes tax increases, increases in transfer payments under the BISP income support program. And it seems to me that this can be self-defeating. If some of the strings that are attached to conditions are, you need to increase taxes and increase redistribution in the face of an economy that has a relatively low level of per capita GDP, very low levels of growth. Redistribution doesn't seem to be the right roadmap to me. Tax increases don't seem to be the right roadmap. And again, I'm not familiar with the full history with Pakistan and the IMF, but I understand there's been about 24 of these programs, and I think that's telling you something. If the 25th program, if these things aren't working, if the country's not able to meet the conditions of these prior programs, clearly the conditions that are attendant to the financing programs are getting in the way of the country's development.
Pakistan faces a lot of problems with overregulation and bureaucratic inefficiency and overreach. How do these emerge? Where does the bureaucratic overreach emerge? Why does the government keep getting bigger and bigger in size? It seems to happen all over the world. What do you think might be the reasons behind this, and what can we do to maybe counter this movement towards big government?
I mentioned that the American Constitution was a libertarian document, and I think that there were many ways in which we didn't live up to the promise of those principles, whether it's the lack of equal, enslaved, the persistence of the institution of slavery in the early history of the United States, the persistence of not granting equal rights to women, to racial minorities, ethnic minorities, to LGBT people, and over time we're trying to reach a higher state of perfection for our country as measured against those principles. But there are many areas in which we've kind of moved in reverse rather than perfecting, these values. We moved in reverse, and I think just the size of government and the things that we allow, government to do. In a democracy, when politicians are seeking elective office by making promises to people, and that we've crossed the line where the national treasury can be used by politicians to buy votes, you're really on a very slippery slope towards government getting bigger and bigger. Right. And when a lot of the red lines of what's a legitimate role of government, what's a legitimate power of government have been crossed, there's kind of no equilibrium until government just continues to get bigger and bigger and usurp more and more power, from the people. And I'm reminded of this in the context of Pakistan, and the fact that you mentioned a large bureaucracy, high levels of regulation, is that Milton Friedman once said that he was asked by leaders of countries, what's the road to prosperity? And he said there were many countries that thought that they should emulate the United States because the United States was a very prosperous country, and if they emulated the things the United States did from a policy perspective or a government perspective, they'd find the route to prosperity. And what he said is that if you're emulating the way the United States is now, it's the wrong formula, because if the United States always had the size of government that it does today, government power that it has today, it never would have become a prosperous country. And so since a lot of these red lines, again, about what's a legitimate use of government power and what's not, have been crossed, a country like Pakistan ends up having, the United States has a bureaucracy that I think is too big, a government that does too much, interferes in too many aspects of our economic and personal life. But that has grown at a time when the country was already prosperous. We have a very strong culture of innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship in economic endeavors. So we can almost survive that albatross, at least for the time being. Right. Whereas if you're a country that is, in the earlier stages of development and growth and prosperity, the cost of that large government, a large regulatory framework that really holds you back from reaching levels of prosperity, it's almost tragic.
Well, the progressivist voices in Pakistan, they seem to be very prominent, especially because they're able to justify many of their interventions around the fact that Pakistan is a poor country, has a large poor population, and they require those social welfare programs, they require those subsidies for industries that have been recognized as being in the infant stage. And a lot of the time they get away with these interventionary recommendations as well. Do you think there's any basis for these kinds of policy interventions that are intrusive, that require more spending on people and require large social welfare programs in countries that are still developing, like Pakistan? Or do you think these actually might be hindrances to for us in moving forward?
I think very much so. First of all, I mentioned when we were talking about libertarianism generally that it's based on, there's a moral foundation about kind of owning your own life. And I actually think it's not a legitimate role of the state to take money from one group of people and then give it to another group of people. It seems pretty basic to me. And the focus shouldn't be on redistributing the pie; it should be on growing the pie.
Correct.
And leaving aside that moral issue. But in a country that is still at an earlier stage of development, a lower level of prosperity, to me the idea of redistribution just seems, almost preposterous. You need to, there's not enough to redistribute. And the focus should really be on what are the conditions that we need with respect to, the rule of law, property rights, lower levels of government intervention, lower levels of bureaucracy, lower levels of regulation to kind of create the environment in which, that economic pie can actually be grown.
One of the arguments that we have started to hear more and more often in regards to redistribution is that there's a growing level of inequality around the world. There are institutions such as Oxfam that have been pushing this idea, and they talk about how most of the wealth is concentrated amongst a few hands, and then the rest of the people are, struggling through high poverty or not making as much as they might be able to. How do you see this argument? What is your counter maybe to this idea?
I think it's it's a great case study in why organizations like Cato and Prime are so important, because we need to get the real story out there. I can't really comment on inequality outside the U.S. or inequality in Pakistan. I've actually visited many developing countries, many poor countries, and what I typically see is actually a pretty high level of economic equality at a very low level. A lot of the, many parts of the population in poverty, but I'm not familiar with the overall statistics. But in the United States, Cato's played a very important role in shining a light on the fact that this narrative that inequality has increased dramatically and has reached some kind of a crisis level just doesn't withstand scrutiny. One of our adjunct scholars, John Early, has done some path-breaking work in this area. He then teamed up with Phil Graham. They wrote a book called The Myth of American Inequality. And one of the things that you notice is so many of the studies that purport to show rising levels of inequality are just flawed in serious ways. Some of them don't include taxes. They don't adjust for changing household size. They don't, fully account for transfer payments. The work that John and Senator Graham have done have shown that the Census Bureau data that's relied on to illustrate to measure income inequality is flawed in that it doesn't include taxes and it doesn't include non-cash transfer payments, which are about 2/3 of transfer payments in the United States. And an incredible showing of their research and analysis is that the Census Bureau divides households into quintiles by income level. And when you actually adjust for taxes and non-cash transfers, the bottom, second from the bottom, and middle quintiles actually have roughly equivalent per capita income. And it's very interesting that you see the market income of each of these quintiles having increased significantly over the last 50 years, with the exception of the bottom quintile, where I think the story there is you destroy the incentives to work when someone in the bottom quintile after transfer payments is earning the same as someone in the middle quintile. And so their assertion is that far from being having too much income inequality, perhaps we don't have enough if we're living in a world where after government intervention, someone in the middle quintile who is working really hard is not getting any further ahead than someone in either of the two quintiles below them.
I've actually heard something similar coming in from the IMF as well, who have argued that higher levels of inequality might also have might be correlated with lower levels of poverty still. So, that is something very interesting. I think I also want to ask you, Pakistan, the federal government of Pakistan also has provincial governments operating at the lower levels. They've consistently, every year, they propose an increase in the minimum wage. So you see an increase in the minimum wage at the federal level, then the provinces will possibly one-up the federal government and even introduce a higher minimum wage level. Do you think that is a good policy for a country where, maybe 50% of the people potentially lie below the poverty line?
I don't think the minimum wage is a good policy for any country. In my own country, people who support the minimum wage or opponents of the minimum wage tend to each trot out their social science, research that shows that either the minimum wage, doesn't kill jobs or it does kill jobs. To me, in my first economics class, I learned about supply and demand curves. And it seems to me I don't need a social science study to tell me that the minimum wage, kills jobs increases incentives for labor substitution, really creates barriers to people who are early in their careers, trying to get that first job and learn the types of things that are going to get them ahead in the future. Also, I think it's important, as I started out talking about, the moral case for liberty. If I want to work for someone and they want to pay me, the government shouldn't have anything to say about whether I can take that job and they can give it to me. It's just really as simple as that.
Right now, Pakistan is facing, or has in the very recent past, faced high inflation levels. We have a fiscal deficit. We have a trade deficit. Now, what would be some of the prescriptions that Cato would maybe advise in dealing with these kinds of problems?
Well, I've only been in Pakistan for a week, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on your economic situation and say what either has caused or needs to be done to curtail inflation. What I will say is, I mentioned our Human Freedom Index. One of the important components of that is sound money. Whether a country has a system in place that creates confidence in the soundness of their currency, which is important from an economic perspective in terms of curtailing inflation or keeping inflation in check, and really it just is very important from an overall economic perspective. You need to know what your unit of exchange is worth, and if it's the value of it's always changing, it makes it very hard to plan, to engage in long-term investment, to take risk, because you have to consider what's the risk of the monetary regime. I am much more familiar with the United States, and we had a dramatic spending blowout in recent years that was accommodated by our fiat money system, which gave rise to our own bout of inflation.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So there seems to be at times a division between the libertarian voices as well regarding how money should behave. So we see some people advocating for the gold standard, return of the gold standard. Then we also see people who have no issues with the fiat currency. And then we have also many voices in libertarian circles who are talking about Bitcoin as maybe a means to move forward with fiat currency ideas. In your opinion, what are the components of sound money, and what strategy is best when trying to overcome many of the challenges we're trying to overcome? And what is the role of the central bank? Should there even be one?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. What I would simply say is Cato has been a pretty important voice for the risks that are attendant to a fiat money system. And we know for sure that a fiat money system where the government has full discretion, to make these decisions is not the right regime. We've made a significant investment in recent years in developing our Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. And we're pretty careful not to say, a gold standard is the answer, or crypto is the answer, or monetary rule is the answer. What we do say is the things we're doing are not the answer. So what we want to see is a movement towards less discretion in monetary policy, more discussion and around alternatives. We really like crypto from the perspective of its experimentation, its free market, experimentation. That we should really welcome in trying to socialize alternatives to our current system. And so we like to see innovation in this regard. We like to see private initiative in this regard.
Oftentimes in Pakistan, one of the reasons that is one of the reasons behind the underdevelopment of the country or the slow development of the country is thought to be a high level of corruption within society, and especially in the government sector. Now, you don't really see Americans talking about corruption that much. How important do you think corruption is in hindering or restricting a country's growth? And how do you see corruption, unraveling in the United States, for example?
I think that it's similar to when it was said earlier when we were talking about redistribution or the level of bureaucracy. The United States is at a different level of development and prosperity than Pakistan.
Right.
So we still have problems with corruption, but they are not as serious a threat to the system, to our prosperity, to our growth, as it is here in Pakistan. But I think that we've talked a lot about the increase in cronyism in the United States, and so corruption is definitely a problem, but a problem that is as big is the capture of government power for private ends, whether it's regulatory capture or lobbying that results in kind of unfair, favoritism in the regulatory regime or in statute. And so that's I think as government has grown, as again we've crossed some of those red lines of what's an exercise of government power that the system accepts, that's become more of a threat. The cronyism in the U.S. has become more of a threat.
What is your opinion on regional blocs, especially those that relate to economic cooperation and regional integration? So we have the classic case of the European Union. Then we also have the ASEAN countries here towards our south. How do you see the role of these regional blocs in the future of the globe? There is obviously the issue of the emergence of the BRICS countries. They are also considering making major changes in the global financial system. They're considering bringing in a new currency, and they're trying to cultivate a whole new culture of financial lending. How do you see this unpacking?
It's hard to generalize about your question because there are a lot of different. You've laid out a number of different issues there. So let me just see if I can separate some of them. I'm very supportive of free trade blocs. Whether bilateral and multilateral, free trade agreements that help lower, the barriers to more open trade. In the United States, I always argue that we have aggregated too much power at a federal level, and I would like to see, the vision of the founders vindicated in this regard. We have a system of federalism. We should try to have as much government policy and government power pushed down into the state and local level where, as citizens, we can actually have some degree of control over what happens. It's very difficult for an organization, even the size of Cato, to have a dramatic impact on federal policy.
Right.
But, a determined individual at the local level or even state level can help drive change. And similarly, on a global or regional level, just like to see more. Once we leave the kind of free trade arena and get into, blocks like the EU where, sovereign control over things like regulation, migration policy, or even if I support or opening migration are surrendered to, a greater regional authority. Don't think that's a good trend. I always favor, more power at a lower level of government, a smaller level of government.
The government really struggles with understanding the kind of work that we're doing many times. Firstly, because it is very different from what many other people are saying, but they also treat us with a certain level of suspicion. Is that something that you also face in the United States at the Cato Institute with your government?
No, I don't think we face suspicion. One of the things I was going to say earlier is, while Cato really has made a serious effort to stay anchored in principle. And one of the good things about the Institute is that's recognized by people across the political spectrum. So we often hear people say, hey, I don't always agree with Cato, But I know they're always telling me what we really think, and that's a huge advantage and very distinct. There are not many organizations in Washington that have that reputation. So in that regard, I don't think people view us with suspicion. I think sometimes they misunderstand our philosophy, and maybe they see us as anti-government zealots. And I don't think that's true. I mean, obviously we believe in a very minimal level of government, but I think that's a way, again, our philosophy gets caricatured. Right. And I think many libertarians have themselves to blame for how they're perceived. A lot of libertarians like to see themselves as radical or extreme, and I think from the perspective of the positioning and marketing of our philosophy, that's to position yourself in the tail of the distribution isn't really very smart. And I don't see I think sometimes people conflate principle being rooted in a philosophy, with being radical or extreme. But I think conflating those is a mistake. I think that, if I look at the political landscape in the United States, people who want to spend trillions of dollars that we don't have and send my grandchildren the bill, that's extreme. People want to tell same-sex couples they can't get married and want to control people's lives, who they can live with, who they can love. That's extreme to me. So I like to consider us the reasonable people. And what's very heartening is with the left in the United States becoming more radical on economic issues over time, and the right now evolving in ways that would be unrecognizable to, say, Ronald Reagan. I hear people now saying about libertarians and about Cato, hey, you men and women are the reasonable people in town. And, that's exactly the way we want to be perceived.
All right. Well, I think I would love to have more time with you, but I know we have to wrap things up. It was a pleasure talking to you, Peter, about these issues. I would have, maybe I would like to get your insight, any advice for organizations like the Prime Institute. Do you think, we work in very under-resourced circumstances, and we often have to confront governments that have a culture or tradition of authoritarianism. Would you have any advice for organizations like us? How do we move forward?
I would say we've talked about the importance of remaining rooted in principle, and I couldn't give you any stronger advice than that. And from what I can tell, Prime has really been, living up to its values during the now 11 years that it's been in existence. And I think continuing to do that, we have very powerful ideas. And we're sometimes up against great challenges, a state that's very large, authoritarianism, and it's easy to be discouraged. But our ideas are very powerful. Liberty works better than anything else, and things that work ultimately win. So we have to remain confident that while in the interim and near term, medium term, there may be very challenging times, ultimately we'll be living in the free and open society that we all all desire. And one thing I will say, you started out saying that Cato has been an inspiration to you. I have to say, whenever I travel around the world and have the privilege to visit with people such as you and your colleagues at Prime, you guys are a tremendous inspiration to us, because we want to make sure that the United States remains a beacon of liberty to the rest of the world. But to see, as you say, resource constrained, being up against tremendous challenges of challenges to economic growth, challenges to freedom, the challenge of authoritarianism, for you guys to be soldiering on and carrying these ideas to more people in your country, it's something that we really deeply admire.
All right. Thank you, Peter. That was a wonderful conversation. As much as I wish to have extended it for another hour, we have to now wind down the show. Thank you so much for the audience for joining us today. on our podcast. And thank you so much to Peter and the rest of the Prime team. Until next time.